All units, stand down. Stand down now.
The reactivation window for Hearthlight's third centennial blackout closed at exactly 0600 hours on the anniversary of its founding. 300 years to the second, since the colony ship Dawn first touched down on a world nobody back on Earth had ever expected to survive its own atmosphere. And Investigator Noor Kestani stood in the observation deck of the relay station anchor point, watching the countdown reach 0 and then, for the first time in the colony's entire recorded history, simply continue counting past it into numbers nobody had a protocol for. "That's not supposed to happen," said the young comms officer at the console beside her, his voice carrying the particular unsettled disbelief of someone watching a system fail in a way the manual had never once described as possible. The first centennial reactivated on the exact second. So did the second, down to the millisecond, both times like clockwork. "This is 3 minutes late, Investigator. Hearthlight has never been 3 minutes late for anything in 300 years. Around them, Anchor Point's other monitoring stations had gone quiet in the particular, contagious way a room falls silent when everyone realizes, at roughly the same moment, that they are watching something happen that none of their training manuals ever anticipated. Technicians who had spent the past year cycling through routine shifts, waiting for what everyone assumed would be an unremarkable ceremonial reactivation, now stood frozen at their consoles, watching a blinking cursor advance through numbers that shouldn't exist, the countdown clock itself seeming to mock the calm certainty with which every briefing document Noor had read described this exact moment as a formality rather than a genuine unknown. Noor did not answer immediately, watching the dead silence on every monitoring channel, the flat, unbroken static that had blanketed the colony's entire hemisphere for the past year, exactly as tradition demanded, and exactly as tradition had never once failed to lift precisely on schedule before. She had read the founding charter as part of her briefing, had absorbed the well-worn, almost reverent language every schoolchild on Earth still learned about humanity's first successful world beyond the solar system. A charter that described the centennial blackout not as superstition, but as sacred discipline. A 100-year drill in total self-reliance that the original colonists had apparently insisted upon from their very first year of settlement. And that every generation since had honored without exception, without complaint, and until this exact moment without a single second of deviation. "Get me a channel to Fleet Command," Noor said finally, "and pull every file we have on the original founding charter, not the summary version taught in schools, priest. I want the actual archived document, word for word, and I want to know if there's a single line in it that explains what's supposed to happen if the blackout doesn't lift when it's supposed to." "There isn't," the comms officer said. "I already checked. The charter describes the blackout beginning, it describes the blackout ending. It doesn't describe anything in between, and it definitely doesn't describe what happens if it just doesn't end." 3 minutes became 3 hours, and 3 hours became a full day. And by the time Noor's shuttle finally received clearance to descend through Hearthlight's dampened atmosphere, the silence from the surface had stretched into something that felt, to everyone monitoring it from orbit, considerably less like a technical malfunction and considerably more like a held breath. What Noor found, stepping off her shuttle onto the colony's central landing plaza beneath a sky the color of old amber, was not the panic or devastation she had half expected after a full day of unexplained silence. It was something considerably stranger. The plaza was full of people, calm, quiet, gathered in loose clusters that reminded her, uncomfortably, of congregations waiting for a service to begin. And every single one of them turned to watch her arrival with the particular unhurried curiosity of people who had been expecting a visitor, simply not certain exactly when. "Investigator Kestani," said a voice from the edge of the gathered crowd, and Noor turned to find an elderly woman approaching with the slow, deliberate gait of someone who had long since stopped needing to hurry for anyone. "I'm glad Fleet Command finally sent someone. I was beginning to worry they'd simply assume the worst and skip straight to an answer none of us would survive." "You know why we're here," Noor said. "I know why you think you're here," the woman said, something almost gentle in her correction. "My name is Selene Marrow. I hold a position on this colony that doesn't have an official title anywhere in Fleet Command's records, though it's been passed down mother to daughter for 9 generations now. I'm called the Keeper Investigator, and I've been waiting 300 years, or my family has on my behalf, for exactly the conversation I suspect you're about to ask me to have." Noor studied her carefully, searching for the deception or evasion she had been trained to expect from colony leadership during a crisis, and found instead something that unsettled her considerably more. Total, unhurried calm, the particular steadiness of someone who had spent an entire lifetime preparing for a single specific moment and had finally, after decades of waiting, watched it arrive exactly as expected. Noor had spent 11 years as a Fleet Command investigator specifically because she had grown up on a colony considerably younger and considerably less storied than Hearthlight, a mining settlement that had nearly failed twice in her own childhood due to bureaucratic decisions made by officials who had never once set foot on the world they were governing from a comfortable distance. She had built her entire career on the conviction that good judgment required proximity, that the people closest to a crisis usually understood it better than the people reviewing summary reports from orbit, and she recognized, standing now before Selene Marrow's careful composure, that everything about this assignment was about to test that conviction more thoroughly than any case she'd handled before. Then start explaining, Noor said. Because right now, Fleet Command has a battle group holding position at the edge of this system, and they are considerably less patient than you appear to be. Selene's expression shifted at that, the first crack Noor had seen in her composure, something that looked almost like grief passing briefly across her weathered features before settling back into careful control. Then we should probably not waste any more time, she said. Walk with me, investigator. What I have to show you isn't something I can explain standing in a landing plaza. Selene led her not toward the colony's administrative center, as Noor had expected, but toward the edge of the settlement, where the plaza's paved stone gave way to a narrow path winding down through terraced gardens that had clearly been cultivated for generations, toward a low, unassuming structure built directly into the hillside, its entrance marked by nothing more ceremonial than a simple archway carved with symbols Noor didn't recognize, worn smooth by 3 centuries of hands passing through. This is where it begins, Selene said, stopping before the archway. Or where it began 300 years ago, when the first Dawn's original survey team found something beneath this hill that never made it into any official report Earth ever received. What kind of something? The kind of something, Selene said, that our founding captain decided in his very first year on this world was worth keeping secret from every government back home for as long as it took to understand what they'd actually found. She met Noor's gaze steadily. I'm about to break a promise 9 generations of my family have kept without exception, Investigator Kestani. I'd ask that you understand before I do that we didn't keep this secret because we didn't trust Earth. We kept it because Captain Calloway understood, better than almost anyone who's come after him, exactly how badly fear can distort good judgment when people are asked to make decisions about something they don't yet understand. Selene's account, delivered slowly as they descended through corridors carved directly into ancient stone, corridors that grew warmer and stranger the deeper they walked, unfolded across the following hour with the careful, practiced cadence of a story that had been told in some form to every keeper's successor for 9 consecutive generations, refined and polished by repetition into something that had the weight and rhythm of scripture without ever losing the raw, human uncertainty at its core. Captain Idris Calloway, commanding the first Dawn on humanity's first true interstellar colonization mission, had brought his ship down onto a world that Earth's own survey probes had flagged as marginal at best, an atmosphere too thin, a soil too poor, temperatures that swung wide enough between day and night to threaten any crop cycle the mission's agricultural planners had prepared for. By every reasonable projection, Hearthlight should have failed within its first decade, one more cautionary footnote in humanity's early, difficult push toward the stars. It had not failed, and the reason Selene explained, standing now in a wide, warm chamber deep beneath the hillside where the stone itself seemed to pulse faintly with a slow, patient rhythm that reminded Noor, uncomfortably, of a heartbeat, was buried directly beneath the very ground the first Dawn had chosen, entirely by accident, to make its first landing. Captain Calloway's survey team found this chamber in their second month, Selene said, gesturing at the space around them, at walls that Noor now realized were not carved stone at all but something considerably older and stranger, a material that shifted almost imperceptibly in color as the light moved across it. They found this, and they found that the ground beneath our original settlement was, against every survey probe's prediction, warm enough to extend growing seasons that should have been impossible. Warm enough to keep water from freezing during a winter that should have killed every crop they'd brought with them. Captain Calloway didn't understand why, not at first. He only understood that his colony, which every projection said should have failed, was somehow surviving, and that the survival seemed to be coming directly from whatever this chamber actually was. And he didn't report it, Noor said. Selene's gaze drifted, for a moment, toward the deeper dark of the chamber ahead, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the particular texture of a story told so many times it had become almost incantatory. The oldest surviving keeper's journal describes that first discovery in more detail than any official record ever will, she said. Captain Calloway came down here alone, against every protocol his own mission charter demanded, because his chief engineer had reported strange thermal readings from beneath the original settlement's foundation, and he wanted to see the source himself before committing it to any official log. He found this chamber sealed behind stone that looked, by every visual inspection, entirely natural, until his hand lamp caught the archway you just walked through and he realized the seams were too regular, too deliberate to be anything but built. He wrote, and I have read this passage more times than I can count, that he stood in that archway for the better part of an hour before he found the courage to walk through it, not because he was afraid of what he might find, but because some instinct told him that once he crossed that threshold, his colony's story would never again be the simple, straightforward survival account Earth expected to read in his quarterly reports. What made him finally walk through? Noor asked. He wrote that he thought of his daughter, Selene said quietly. 6 years old, asleep in a habitat module above ground that was already, by every honest projection, not going to keep her alive past the first hard winter. He decided that whatever waited in the dark, it could not possibly be worse than watching her die slowly on a world Earth had sent them to settle without giving them any real chance of success. He walked through the archway that night, Investigator, and by morning, the readings from the original settlement's foundation had shifted just enough to extend that winter's growing window by nearly 3 weeks. He never confirmed, not in any journal entry I've ever read, whether that shift was coincidence or response. But he chose, from that morning forward, to act as though it had been a response, and to treat whatever lived beneath this hill as something owed careful, patient gratitude rather than fearful suspicion. He didn't report it, Selene confirmed, because within his first year something considerably stranger than unexplained warmth happened. The chamber spoke to him, not in words, not at first, in patterns, resonances that his engineers eventually learned to interpret slowly, painstakingly over years as something closer to a request than a message. This structure, Investigator, whoever built it, offered our founders exactly what they needed to survive an impossible world. And it asked, in return, for something that seemed, at the time, like an almost absurdly small price. Isolation, Noor said slowly, understanding beginning to take shape. The blackout. Not merely isolation, Selene said. Total isolation, cyclical, on a schedule the structure itself seemed to specify, though our founders never fully understood why, not for generations. Captain Calloway's engineers determined, as best they could, that whatever process this structure was undergoing, whatever slow, patient work it had been quietly performing since long before humanity ever arrived on this world, required periods of complete disconnection from outside electromagnetic interference to properly continue. Every 100 years, the structure would need this colony to go dark completely for exactly one full cycle, in order to protect something delicate enough that even the ordinary hum of Earth communications traffic threatened to disrupt it. And the founders just agreed to that, Noor said. No questions, no demands for a fuller explanation. They asked every question they could think to ask, Selene said. The structure answered what it could, in the slow, patient language it seemed to communicate in, resonance and pattern rather than words we could easily translate. What we understood, even truly imperfectly, across generations of careful study, was this. This structure is not a machine in any sense your training would recognize, Investigator. It is closer to a seed. A very old, very patient seed, planted by a civilization long since vanished from any record we've ever managed to access, designed to slowly, carefully grow into something across a timeline measured not in years or decades but in centuries, requiring exactly the kind of undisturbed stillness our own ancestors' first crisis of survival taught them, quite by accident, how to provide. If any part of this discovery has you as unsettled and curious as it left Noor standing in that warm, ancient chamber, now's a good moment to hit like, subscribe if you haven't yet, and drop a comment telling me what you think is actually growing beneath that hillside, and whether you think Fleet Command is going to give this colony the time it needs to find out. Because outside in orbit, that patience is running out considerably faster than anyone underground currently realizes. Why the secrecy, though? Noor pressed, as they continued deeper into the warm, pulsing chamber, even after your founders understood what they were dealing with. Why not report it to Earth once you knew it wasn't dangerous? Selene's expression at that question carried the particular weariness of someone who had turned this exact question over in her own mind more times than she could count. Because Captain Calloway understood something about fear that I don't think has changed at all in 300 years, Investigator. He understood that a discovery this strange, reported to a government still cautious and uncertain about humanity's first tentative steps beyond its own solar system, would not be met with patience. It would be met with committees and containment protocols, and almost certainly, eventually, with a decision to seize or study or neutralize whatever this structure actually was, made by people who had never stood in this chamber, never felt this warmth, never had the chance to understand what they were deciding to destroy before they destroyed it. So he lied, Noor said, built an entire cover story, the Centennial Self-Reliance Drill. He built a story that was true enough to survive scrutiny, Selene corrected gently. The blackout is a genuine test of self-reliance, Investigator. This colony genuinely does have to survive an entire year cut off from outside resupply and support every 100 years, and that genuinely has shaped who we are generation after generation in exactly the ways the official charter describes. Captain Calloway simply never told Earth the real reason the tradition began, because he understood that the true reason would never survive being handed to people who hadn't earned the patience to hear it properly. What happened at the very first centennial, Noor asked, when the blackout finally lifted for the first time? Calloway was gone by then, wasn't he? He was, Selene said. He died 11 years before that first reactivation, an ordinary death, old age, and a body worn down by decades of hard settlement work. Though the journal his successor kept describes him spending his final months almost entirely occupied with preparing the colony's second generation for a responsibility he would not live to see them carry. His daughter, the same one he'd thought of standing in that archway on his very first night in this chamber, became the second keeper. And she wrote, in an entry I've read more times than any other in our entire family archive, that she spent the final hours of that first centennial blackout genuinely uncertain whether the structure would honor its side of an arrangement made with a man who could no longer speak for his people. She stood exactly where you're standing now, Investigator, not knowing whether 3 generations of careful stewardship had been building toward salvation or toward nothing at all. When the pulse steadied and the blackout lifted precisely on schedule, she wrote that she wept not from relief exactly, but from the sudden, overwhelming understanding that her father's faith had been the correct choice all along, and that the burden of proving it again would now fall to her, and to however many generations came after. They arrived, as Selene finished speaking, at the chamber's innermost space, where the pulsing warmth Noor had felt growing steadily stronger throughout their descent, resolved into something she found herself entirely unprepared to process. A vast, softly glowing structure embedded directly into the bedrock, its surface shifting slowly through colors that had no easy name, pulsing in a rhythm that had, over the past day, clearly accelerated well beyond whatever baseline 300 years of careful observation had established as normal. This is new, Selene said quietly, studying the structure with an expression that mixed wonder and unmistakable unease in equal measure. The pulse rate, the color shift, nothing in 9 generations of Keeper's records describes anything close to this. The first 2 centennials, the structure simply went quiet during isolation and returned to its baseline state the moment contact resumed. This time, Investigator, it hasn't returned to baseline. If anything, it's accelerating. You said this is only the 3rd centennial the secret's been kept through, Noor said. That means it's already survived scrutiny once before at the 2nd. Nothing came close to exposing it. Selene allowed herself a thin, humorless smile. Once, during the 2nd centennial, roughly 100 years ago, an overzealous young systems auditor attached to the observation fleet grew suspicious of a minor discrepancy in the colony's official energy consumption logs, a figure that didn't quite match what the self-reliance drill should have produced on its own. My grandmother was keeper then. She spent 4 days walking that auditor through every terraced field and every irrigation channel on this colony, patiently, exhaustively, until the discrepancy resolved itself into nothing more alarming than an unusually efficient geothermal tap the colony's own engineers had by that point built an entire cover explanation around. The auditor filed his report satisfied and went home none the wiser. My grandmother used to say that was the closest this colony ever came to losing everything, not because the structure was in any danger, but because for 4 days she had to hold an entire secret behind a face that could not afford to show a single moment of doubt. Selene's gaze moved back to the pulsing archway ahead of them. I have often wondered, since I inherited this role, what she would have done if she'd known the 3rd centennial would be the one that finally broke the pattern she spent her whole life protecting. You don't know what that means, Noor said. I don't know what that means, Selene admitted. Which is precisely why I need you to understand, before you report anything back to your fleet command, that whatever is happening here right now has never happened before, not in 300 years of careful, patient stewardship. This isn't a colony hiding a dangerous secret from Earth, Investigator. This is a colony standing at the edge of something none of us, not even 9 generations of keepers, has ever actually witnessed. And I am asking you, as directly as I know how, to help me buy this colony enough time to find out what it is before someone in orbit decides the safest response to an unknown is simply to erase it. That fear, Noor understood with a sinking certainty even as Selene finished speaking, was not remotely hypothetical. Commander Faisal Idrissi, leading the battle group currently holding position at Hearthlight system boundary, had made his position clear in the brief, tense exchange Noor had managed before her shuttle lost contact with orbit during descent, an exchange that had left her with considerably less confidence in Fleet Command's patience than Selene's calm certainty seemed to assume was warranted. You have 6 hours, Investigator, Idrissi had told her. his voice carrying the particular controlled tension of a commander who had already run every possible worst-case scenario through his own calculations and did not like any of the answers he'd found. 6 hours to give me a clear, verified explanation for why humanity's oldest colony has gone silent well past its scheduled reactivation, or I am authorized, under Fleet Command's standing containment protocols for unexplained colonial anomalies, to treat this as a potential existential threat and respond accordingly. I do not want to give that order, Investigator. I have family who trace their lineage back to the first Dawn's original crew. But I will give it, if you cannot give me something better than a colony full of people who claim everything is fine, while refusing to explain why they've broken 300 years of perfect scheduling discipline. Aboard the flagship Constancy, holding position at the edge of Hearthlight system while Noor's investigation unfolded on the surface below, Commander Idrissi's own bridge crew was, in the hours following that exchange, growing considerably less patient than he was. His tactical officer, a sharp, capable woman named Reyna Volkov who had served under him for 6 years and had never once been shy about voicing disagreement, made her position clear less than an hour into the countdown. Sir, with respect, we are treating an unprecedented energy signature beneath humanity's oldest and most symbolically significant colony as a diplomatic negotiation, instead of the potential existential threat our own protocols classify it as. If this were any other world, any other population, we would already be moving to containment posture. I understand the historical weight of what we're looking at. I don't think historical weight should be allowed to override a threat assessment. Noted Commander Volkov, Idrissi said, watching the same energy readouts that had prompted her concern, feeling the particular uncomfortable weight of a decision that would be scrutinized, regardless of outcome, for decades to come. I share your concern about the readings. I do not yet share your conclusion about what they require of us. Sir, if this is some kind of unknown offensive capability activating beneath an unshielded civilian population, every minute we wait is a minute. We lose the tactical advantage of acting before it fully matures. And if it isn't, Idrissi said quietly, every minute we don't wait is a minute we spend closer to erasing 300 years of history, and however many innocent lives based on nothing more than our own discomfort with not fully understanding what we're looking at. I have read the same historical archive you have, Commander. I know what happened the last time a fleet commander decided an unexplained colonial anomaly was safer destroyed than investigated. I have no intention of adding my own name to that list of regrets without exhausting every other option first. Volkov did not press further, though Idrissi could see, in the careful, professional stillness of her expression, that she remained unconvinced, and he understood, watching the countdown continue its relentless progress toward zero, that whatever decision he ultimately made would need to be strong enough to hold not merely against his own doubts, but against the entirely reasonable doubts of every officer serving under his command. The pressure did not remain confined to his own bridge for long. 2 hours into the extended observation window, a priority channel opened from Fleet Command's central administration, carrying the clipped, impatient voice of Admiral Karina Salt, whose jurisdiction technically extended over every containment decision Idrissi's rank authorized him to make independently, and who made her own position considerably less ambiguous than his had been with Volkov. Commander, I am looking at the same energy readings you are, and I am not currently seeing sufficient justification for your decision to stand down containment posture on humanity's oldest colony, she said. I understand the historical sensitivity involved. I do not believe historical sensitivity should be permitted to override a demonstrated, escalating anomaly of this magnitude. You have my authorization to resume protocol standing orders immediately, Commander, and frankly, I would strongly encourage you to do so before this situation develops further beyond anyone's control. Respect, Admiral, Idrissi said, choosing his words with the particular care of a man aware he was staking his entire career on the next several sentences. I have spent the last several hours receiving direct testimony from residents of this colony, cross-referenced against 300 years of unbroken record, and I do not believe the evidence currently supports treating an accelerating but consistently non-hostile phenomenon as an active threat requiring immediate destruction. I am requesting an additional window, under my own authority and my own accountability, to allow Investigator Kestani's assessment to reach its natural conclusion before any irreversible action is taken. You understand, Commander, that if you are wrong, this conversation will be the first thing any inquiry board reviews. I understand that, Admiral, Idrissi said. I also understand that if I am right and we destroy this colony anyway out of an abundance of caution nobody bothered to test, that failure will never appear in any inquiry board's record at all, because there will be no one left to file the complaint. I would rather answer for a decision made with full information than for one made simply because it was easier to justify afterward. The silence that followed carried its own considerable weight, and when Admiral Assault finally responded, her voice had lost some of its earlier sharpness, replaced by the particular grudging respect of a superior officer recognizing, however reluctantly, the outline of an argument she could not immediately dismantle. You have 4 hours beyond your original window, Commander, and I want continuous data feeds the entire time. If those readings cross into anything resembling a genuine hostile signature, I will not wait for your recommendation before authorizing containment myself. Understood, Admiral, Idrissi said, and closed the channel with the distinct, uneasy sense that he had bought Hearthlight time but not yet safety. Nor relayed as much of this to Selene as she judged necessary, watching the older woman's expression tighten with a controlled, weary dread that suggested this was not, in fact, a scenario 9 generations of keepers had entirely failed to anticipate. 6 hours, Selene repeated. Captain Calloway used to say, according to the oldest surviving keeper's journal, that the greatest danger this colony would ever face wasn't the structure itself, but the moment someone finally discovered it and had to decide under pressure whether to trust 300 years of careful stewardship or simply act on the fear of not fully understanding what they were looking at. She met Noor's gaze steadily. I cannot give you a complete explanation in 6 hours, Investigator. I don't have one. What I can give you is 300 years of evidence that this structure and this colony's relationship with it has only ever produced life. Better harvests, warmer winters, a community that has survived against every original projection on a world that should have killed us within a decade. I am asking you to carry that evidence to your commander, and I am asking you to trust it, because I don't believe either of us has any better option remaining in the time we've been given. Noor spent the following 2 hours doing something she suspected her fleet command training had never quite prepared her to do with appropriate rigor. She walked the colony, spoke with as many residents as time allowed, and found in every single conversation the same unhurried, unshaken confidence Selene herself had displayed. Farmers and engineers and schoolteachers who described the accelerating pulse beneath the hillside not with fear, but with a kind of cautious, reverent anticipation. The particular calm of people who had spent their entire lives being taught, patiently and consistently, that this strange inheritance beneath their feet had never once given them reason to doubt it. The signs of change were not confined to the chamber alone. Walking the colony's outer paths, Noor noticed the terrace streams running warmer than the ambient air should have allowed, faint threads of steam rising off water that had, by every colonist's casual account, simply always run a little warm near the hillside, though never quite this warm before. Flocks of the small, ground-dwelling birds the colonists called hearthlarks had gathered in unusually dense clusters along the ridge overlooking the archway's entrance, their calls softer and more synchronized than the ordinary scattered chatter Noor had heard on her descent that morning, and an elderly beekeeper tending hives near the terraced fields told her, without any apparent alarm, that her colonies had produced honey with a faint golden shimmer overnight that she'd never seen in 40 years of keeping bees on this world. My grandmother used to say the hearth chose us, a young farmer named Talia Reyes told her, standing at the edge of a terraced field that stretched golden and impossibly lush toward the horizon, crops that should not by any reasonable agricultural model have thrived on a world this marginal. Not the other way around. She said Captain Calloway didn't find something to exploit, Investigator. He found something that needed patient people to take care of it, and we've spent 300 years trying to be worthy of that trust. I don't know what's happening down there right now any more than the Keeper does. But I know what this place has given us for 300 years, and I'm not about to start doubting it just because it's finally doing something we've never seen before. An older man named Osric Fenn, who had spent 40 years maintaining the colony's irrigation systems, and Noor learned sat on the small informal council that assisted each keeper without ever holding the title itself, found her near the edge of the plaza and offered a somewhat more measured perspective than Talia's easy faith. I won't pretend none of us are worried, he said, watching the strange golden light of the steaming streams with an expression that mixed genuine unease alongside his calm. Worry and panic aren't the same thing, Investigator, whatever your fleet command's protocols might assume. We're worried the way you worry about a loved one in surgery, not the way you'd panic watching a house catch fire. There's a difference, and I'd ask you to carry that difference back to whoever's making decisions about us in orbit, because I don't think that distinction is one people who have never lived here would think to make on their own. Noor found the colony's schoolteacher, a soft-spoken woman named Priya Vantana, holding an ordinary lesson in a courtyard near the settlement center. Children seated in loose rows despite the extraordinary circumstances unfolding beneath their feet, and lingered at the edge of the gathering long enough to hear the lesson's subject. Not mathematics or history, but the same founding story Fen Adair told in other colonies' common halls, retold here in gentler, simpler language for younger ears. We teach it every year, not just during the centennial, Priya explained afterward, walking with Noor toward the plaza. Not the full secret, not until a child is old enough and trusted enough to become part of the Keepers counsel themselves. But the shape of it, the patience, the choice Captain Calloway made standing in that archway. Every child in this colony grows up understanding that the hardest, most important decisions rarely announce themselves as history in the moment they're made. They usually look from the inside like a frightened man simply deciding to take one more step forward instead of turning back. She glanced toward the hillside, where the accelerating pulse remained visible now even from a distance, a faint golden shimmer rising off the terraced fields surrounding it. I don't know what's happening down there any better than you do, Investigator, but I know that every single one of my students is going to grow up understanding this exact day as part of the same story, whatever the ending turns out to be. I'd like that ending to be one they're proud to inherit. It was, Noor reflected, watching the young woman return to her work with the same unhurried calm that seemed to define every conversation she'd had across the colony, a considerably more persuasive argument than any technical data she'd managed to gather from the chamber itself, though she understood with growing unease that persuasive arguments built on generations of trust were unlikely to carry much weight with a fleet commander running out of patience 4 hours into a 6-hour countdown. Staring down the unexplained silence of humanity's oldest and most historically significant colony, she returned to the chamber to find Selene standing before the structure, watching its accelerating pulse with an expression that had shifted, in the hours since Noor's departure, from careful unease into something considerably more urgent. "It's changing," Selene said without turning. "Look." Noor followed her gaze to the structure's surface, where the slow, shifting colors had begun resolving, for the first time in the recorded history of 9 generations of careful observation, into something that looked unmistakably like patterns, intricate and deliberate, spreading across the ancient material in formations that reminded Noor, with a chill she couldn't entirely suppress, of star charts. "Do you recognize any of it?" Noor asked. "No," Selene admitted, "but I don't think recognition is the point, Investigator. I think this is the culmination Captain Calloway's original engineers theorized about but never lived to see, the completion of whatever process this structure has been quietly, patiently pursuing since long before we ever arrived on this world. I think after 300 years of careful stewardship, this hearth is finally ready to become whatever it was always meant to become. And I think we are standing at the exact moment humanity either earns the chance to witness that, or loses it forever to a fleet commander's understandable, reasonable, catastrophic fear of the unknown." Noor's comm unit crackled to life at that exact moment, Commander Idrissi's voice carrying across the connection with the clipped urgency of a man watching his own deadline close in considerably faster than he'd hoped. "Investigator Kestani, report. You have 90 minutes remaining, and my sensor readings from orbit are showing energy signatures beneath that colony that are climbing well outside any baseline we have on record. I need something concrete right now, or I am moving this fleet to containment posture." Noor looked at Selene, at the slow, deliberate patterns spreading across the ancient structure's surface, at 90 minutes standing between 300 years of patient stewardship and a fear-driven decision that would erase whatever this culmination actually was before anyone had the chance to understand it. "Commander," she said, opening the channel fully, "I need you to listen to something before you make that decision, not a report. A recording. I want you to hear exactly what I've been hearing down here for the past 6 hours from the people who have spent 300 years earning the right to be trusted with something none of us fully understand yet." What followed over the next 60 minutes was not a single dramatic argument but a patient cumulative case that Noor assembled in real time, transmitting fragment after fragment of testimony up to Idrissi's flagship. Talia Rays describing crops that should not exist. An elderly engineer explaining 3 centuries of meticulous, careful observation that had never once documented harm. Selene Marrow's own steady, unshaken account of a promise 9 generations of her family had kept not out of secrecy for its own sake, but out of hard-won understanding that some discoveries required patience Earth's institutions had never quite learned how to offer. Osric Fenn's testimony, transmitted midway through that hour, proved unexpectedly persuasive aboard the Constancy, according to what Idrissi would later tell Noor, precisely because it offered no easy reassurance at all. "I am not going to tell your commander this is safe," the old irrigation engineer said, addressing the recording directly, his weathered face steady despite the gravity of what he understood was riding on his words. "I don't know that, and I won't pretend otherwise to make anyone's decision easier. What I will tell him is that 300 years of patient, careful people have tended this thing without a single documented act of harm, and that the version of caution that leads with force before understanding has never once, in all of human history, made anything actually safer. I'd ask him to consider which kind of caution he wants his own grandchildren to inherit from this decision." "I am not asking you to trust the structure, Commander," Noor said, in the final minutes before the countdown's expiration, standing once more in the warm, pulsing chamber as the patterns across its surface continued their slow, deliberate spread. I am asking you to trust 300 years of unbroken evidence, and a colony full of people who have never once, in 3 centuries, given Earth a single reason to doubt their judgment until this exact moment, when the only thing they've actually done differently is ask for a little more patience than usual. The silence that followed stretched long enough that Noor began to fear she had simply run out of time, the countdown on her display ticking down through its final minutes with the same indifferent precision that had once governed the colony's own centennial schedule. Until, with less than 4 minutes remaining, Commander Idrissi's voice returned to the channel, carrying a weight Noor had not heard from him since their very first exchange. My great-great-grandmother, he said slowly, served as a navigator aboard the first Dawn Investigator. I have never once in my entire career mentioned that fact in any official capacity because I did not believe it was relevant to my judgment as a commanding officer. I find myself reconsidering that position rather urgently in the past several minutes. He paused, and Noor could hear, even through the flat compression of the comm channel, the particular difficulty of a man weighing institutional duty against something considerably more personal. Fleet is standing down from containment posture, Investigator Kestani. I am authorizing an extended observation window, not because your evidence has fully convinced me, but because I find I am no longer willing to be the man who erased whatever my own ancestor helped build, out of fear of something none of us have taken the time to properly understand. On the Constancy's bridge, Commander Volkov received the stand-down order with visible, if carefully controlled, tension, and Idrissi, watching her expression, understood he owed her more than a simple directive. I know this isn't the decision your threat assessment recommended, Commander, he said, once the channel to the surface had closed. I'm not asking you to agree with it. I'm asking you to help me monitor it as carefully as our protocols allow, so that if I am wrong, we lose as little time as possible correcting course. Understood, sir, Volkov said, and after a moment added with the particular grudging honesty of an officer who valued candor over easy agreement. For what it's worth, if you are wrong, I'd rather it be because you gave a 300-year-old colony the benefit of the doubt than because you didn't. I just hope Investigator Kestani's testimony holds up as well in the history books as it did in the last hour of that countdown. Noor felt something in her chest loosen that she had not fully realized, until that exact moment, had been held rigid since the countdown first began, and turned to find Selene watching her with an expression of profound, quiet relief. The particular exhaustion of someone who had spent 300 years of inherited vigilance finally, however temporarily, allowed to rest. The structure's transformation, when it finally reached its culmination roughly 11 hours later, unfolded not as the violent, dramatic event Noor's fleet command training had conditioned her to brace for, but as something considerably quieter and considerably more profound. The intricate patterns spreading across the chamber's surface resolved, slowly and deliberately, into a single, stable configuration, and the warm pulse that had defined the structure for 300 years of careful observation settled into a new, steady rhythm, accompanied by a soft, resonant tone that seemed to fill the entire chamber without ever growing uncomfortably loud. Noor stood beside Selene through the final stretch of that transformation, watching light gather along the structure's deepest seams and travel outward in slow, deliberate waves, each wave leaving behind a fainter, more permanent glow than the one before, until the entire chamber seemed to breathe with a soft, golden luminescence that had no obvious source and cast no harsh sh. Although anywhere it touched, the resonant tone deepened gradually into something layered and complex, and though neither of them could identify a single word or meaning within it, Noor found herself thinking unbidden that it sounded considerably less like an alarm and considerably more like the low, patient hum of something enormous finally exhaling after a very long-held breath. Colonists had gathered at the chamber's outer entrance by then, word of the change having spread through the settlement in the same quiet, unhurried way everything in Hearthlight seemed to travel, and Noor watched their faces in the shifting light, finding not fear in any of them but the particular hushed wonder of people witnessing something they had spent their entire lives being taught to hope, for without ever being promised they would live to see it. It's not a weapon, Selene said quietly, standing beside Noor as they watched the transformation settle into its final form, a structure that now unmistakably resembled something closer to an intricate geometric archway embedded directly into the ancient stone. And I don't believe it's simply a gift either, Investigator. I believe, based on everything the codex fragments we've slowly translated over 3 generations suggest, that this is a gateway, or the beginning of one. A connection point, deliberately, patiently grown across 3 centuries, to something considerably larger than a single colony on a single marginal world. Connection to what? Noor asked. I don't know yet, Selene admitted, something like wonder finally breaking through the careful composure she had maintained throughout the entire ordeal. But I believe, Investigator, that we are about to find out, And I believe we are about to find out because a fleet commander somewhere in orbit chose, in the final minutes of a countdown, to trust 300 years of patient stewardship over the easier, faster comfort of fear. In the weeks that followed, as Fleet Command's own scientific teams descended to Hearthlight to begin the careful, collaborative work of understanding exactly what the colony's ancient hearth had become, Noor found herself returning, again and again, to a single conversation she'd had with Talia Reyes on that first tense day, standing at the edge of impossibly lush fields on a world that should never have supported them. The Gateway's full significance, once Fleet Command's xenoarchaeological teams had spent several careful months studying it alongside Selene and her small council, proved to be considerably larger than even Selene had initially dared hope. The structure they eventually confirmed was indeed a connection point, one of what appeared to be a scattered network of similar dormant seeds planted across dozens of marginal, difficult worlds throughout the region by a precursor civilization whose name had not survived translation, worlds chosen, the researchers theorized, specifically because their harshness would demand exactly the kind of patient, cooperative resilience that made a species worthy of eventual connection. Hearthlight, against every early survey probe's grim prediction, had not merely survived its impossible landing. It had been quietly, deliberately tested by it for 300 years and had finally, through nothing more dramatic than 3 centuries of unbroken faithfulness, passed. Preliminary signals traced through the Gateway's newly stabilized architecture suggested, according to the cautious early reports Noor read before her own departure, the faint but unmistakable presence of other nodes elsewhere in the network beginning to register Hearthlight's activation, distant echoes of a conversation that might, given years or decades of the same patient care the colony had already shown, eventually connect humanity to neighbors considerably older and considerably farther flung than anything Fleet Command's exploratory fleets had encountered in all their prior expansion. Nothing about that wider network was rushed into confirmation. Selene herself insisted, in every council meeting Noor sat in on before leaving, that whatever waited on the far side of those distant echoes deserved exactly the same unhurried patience Hearthlight had spent 3 centuries learning to offer, rather than the eager, grasping haste of a species suddenly handed proof it was not alone. "You said the hearth chose you," Noor said, finding the young farmer once more among her terraced crops, the newly formed gateway now visible as a faint, steady glow at the base of the hillside beyond, still under careful study, still not yet fully understood, but no longer hidden, no longer a secret 300 years in the keeping. "Do you still believe that?" "More than ever," Talia said, smiling. "I think it chose patient people, Investigator. Not because we're special, but because patience was the one thing this world actually needed from us, and we happen to be desperate enough in that very first year to learn how to give it. I think that's probably true of most things worth having. They don't go to the people who demand them fastest. They go to the people willing to wait long enough to deserve them." Selene Marrow's role as keeper, once a secret carried in careful silence across 9 generations, became, in the months following the Gateway's stabilization, something considerably more public, a formal position within the colony's now fully transparent relationship with Fleet Command. And when Noor asked her, during one of their last conversations before her own return to Earth, whether she found the sudden loss of secrecy difficult after a lifetime of careful guardianship, the older woman simply smiled, watching the Gateway's steady glow through the chamber's entrance. "I spent my entire life preparing to be the last keeper who had to carry this alone," Selene said. "I find I'm considerably more at peace with being the first keeper who gets to share it. Captain Calloway kept this secret because he didn't trust the world he'd left behind to meet it with patience. I'd like to think, Investigator, that after 300 years and one very close call in a chamber not unlike this one, we've finally proven him at least partially wrong." Commander Idrissi visited the colony himself, some months later, during a formal Fleet Command delegation sent to establish permanent protocols for the Gateway's continued study, and sought Noor out during a quiet moment away from the delegation's official proceedings, standing together at the edge of the same terraced fields where she had first spoken with Talia Reyes. "I've thought a great deal since that countdown about how close I came to giving an order I would never have been able to take back," he admitted. "I keep returning to something Osric Fenn said in his testimony, about which kind of caution I wanted my grandchildren to inherit. I don't think I fully understood until I stood in that chamber myself last week exactly how much weight that question actually carried." "What made the difference in the end?" Noor asked. "You'd already decided to stand down before the Gateway finished forming. The evidence hadn't fully resolved yet. You were still choosing trust over certainty." Idrissi considered the question for a long moment, watching the Gateway's distant glow beyond the hillside. "I think," he said finally, "it was the simple fact that in 300 years this colony never once asked Earth for anything it didn't need, and never once gave Earth a reason to regret trusting it. That's a harder thing to find than most of Fleet Command's containment protocols account for, Investigator." I decided somewhere in those final minutes that a record like that deserved more patience than fear alone was prepared to give it. Noor stood with Selene a final time before her own return to Earth, watching the gateway's quiet, steady light, thinking about a colony that had never once in 3 centuries deviated from its promise until the exact moment that promise finally, impossibly, came due, and understood with the particular clarity that came after surviving something that could so easily have ended in catastrophe, that the truest measure of what Hearthlight had built beneath its hillside was not the gateway itself. However extraordinary, but the 300 years of quiet, unglamorous faithfulness that had made humanity worthy of finding it waiting, patiently, exactly where they'd left it.